This is a webinar that is produced in conjunction with an in-depth investigation in which the C3 Literacy Collaborative Project pilot teacher team leaders and groups can take information from this webinar and investigate the content further and connect it to their work by visiting the literacyandlearningexchange.org site. I will provide that link at the end of the webinar so that you all can visit there. If you are not a member of the pilot team, teacher teams, you are still able to join the Literacy and Learning Exchange and to follow groups and to take part in the investigations that have been posted there. I will now get to the presentation here, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. S.G. Grant, Professor of Social Studies Education at Binghamton University, Binghamton, New York. He is also the project director for New York Social Studies Toolkit Project and a senior advisor and contributing writer to the C3 framework, as well as the author of several books and journal articles. S.G., welcome, and let me turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Anna. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm S.G. Grant. As Anna said, I'm Professor of Social Studies Education, and I was a senior advisor and contributing writer to the C3 framework. I'm really pleased to be part of this program of webinars aimed at supporting the implementation of the framework, because as you all know, developing a framework is one piece of work, but actually having it implemented in the classroom is quite another. So in this session, we focus on Dimension 1 of the C3 framework, developing questions and planning inquiries. Investigations that will come after this one will look at other dimensions of the inquiry arc, as well as topics such as using the C3 with teacher education. So you can see that our purposes are three: to the importance of questions in framing a unit of study, the relationship between compelling and supporting questions, and then distinctive features of compelling questions. Well, why questions? From Socrates on, frankly, the value of questions in general and for teaching and learning in particular has been well established. In Plato's Protagoras, Socrates claims, quote, "My way toward truth is to ask the right questions." Now, we all know answers are really important, especially on high-stakes exams. But a well-framed question can really excite the mind and give real and genuine meaning to the study of any social issue. So as you can see from these quotes, questions have gotten quite a bit of attention, and by a wide array of thinkers, from philosophers to dramatists to poets and scientists. I think my favorite quote, however, is the last one. Quote, the art and science of asking questions is the source of all knowledge. So if we're going to talk about inquiry-based teaching, and a very good place to start, it seems to me, is with questions. And questions are where the C3 framework inquiry arc starts. In content-rich subjects like social studies, teaching and learning have traditionally focused on finding facts first and then thinking later. That approach simply has not worked for most kids. The inquiry arc reframes that traditional approach by highlighting the use of questions as a way to drive a social studies inquiry. So rather than start on page 1 of the textbook, let's start with a question that gets under kids' skin. So now let's turn to compelling and supporting questions. We'll begin with a short piece of video where I talk about the nature of questions and the inquiry arc, and then we'll dig in a little deeper into the distinctive features. Anna?
Another one of our C3 rock stars. This is Dr. S.G. Grant. He is professor and dean of the Graduate School of Education at Binghamton University. Dr. Grant worked closely with the team as the architect for the conceptual design of the document. S.G., we just heard Kathy talk about the inquiry arc and the 4 dimensions. Can you drill down a little bit for us to explain what these concepts and approaches really mean to the social studies teacher in the field?
I'd be happy to, Michelle. Good evening to you and to Susan. I'm thrilled to be with you all tonight. I actually want to begin with a quote by Jerome Bruner from his book, The Process of Education. He said, "We begin with a hypothesis that any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development. Now, we didn't include that quote in the framework. We probably should have, because the spirit of it really infuses the entire document. It's a big challenge to think that we could teach any idea to any child, but in fact, that's what we're all about. And I think that in lots of ways, the inquiry arc kind of encapsulates what Bruner was talking about. It's a set of interlocking, mutually supportive ideas that really kind of highlight the intersection of teachers, learners, and ideas. And I want to come back to that point a little bit later. But let me talk a little bit more specifically about the actual dimensions of the inquiry arc. Those 4 dimensions are: 1, developing questions and planning inquiries; 2, applying disciplinary concepts and tools; 3, evaluating sources and using evidence; and 4, communicating conclusions and taking informed action. You know, in lots of ways, social studies at its heart is really about understanding why people do the things they do. Some of those things are noble and ambitious and brave, and some of those things are cowardly and silly and naive. But they all make up the fabric of social life. And so, in some ways, everything that people do and say and think is fair game for social studies. That, of course, gives us this incredible terrain of material to work with. And that can be a great thing, but it can also be an intimidating thing. And so the inquiry arc, I think, in lots of ways, helps us make some decisions about how to approach teaching units and lessons. So a bit about each one of the dimensions. First of all, this developing questions and planning inquiries is really designed to front load the notion that social studies is about inquiry. It's about the questions that teachers and students create, bring to class, and then spend time thinking through. But you can't just spend all of your day asking questions. And so you need to start thinking about what are some of the ideas that we already know about the topics that those questions are based on. So the second dimension is really about this notion of identifying and applying the disciplinary concepts and tools. Now, in some cases, the questions that students and teachers have will be focused on a single discipline. A question like, what are you going to use your money for? Lunch or a video game? Sounds like an economics question. Whereas other kinds of questions, and I would argue that, frankly, most questions probably are more interdisciplinary in nature. So a question like, should we continue building transcontinental oil pipelines, has an economic focus to it, but it also has a real important political, social, and geographical dimension to it as well. So these ideas of discipline, knowledge, and skills, and concepts and tools is really critical. The reason I wanted to show that clip is because while this webinar focuses on questions and planning inquiries, as any of you who have been working with the inquiry arc know, you really have to think about all 4 dimensions of it sort of at the same time. Otherwise, you can get kind of focused on a great question and then realize that there's really not enough information perhaps to support it. And the place that you end up having students in terms of writing their summative argument, again, may not be where you really want to spend their time. There are some questions in the reflection and discussion section that I included in the draft of the investigation that I would suggest you think about. But I think they might be useful as you work with other teachers and your colleagues around the country. So let's move on, because of course not all questions are alike, and nor are they all equally useful for instruction. So let's look a bit more specifically at compelling questions, both what defines them and some examples. Well, one of the primary characteristics of a compelling question is that it helps frame an inquiry or a unit under study. To that end, a compelling question helps teachers and students collect, organize, and pursue their ideas through the task of answering the question. They also have to be intellectually rigorous, however, and relevant to students. Compelling questions address key ideas, topics, problems found across the academic disciplines, but they also reflect the ideas and experiences that students bring to class. Finally, compelling questions need to give some direction to students in terms of any kind of summative performance task that you have them do. The key, however, I really feel like the key to compelling questions is hitting that spot, the sweet spot between qualities of intellectually rigorous and relevant to students. So by intellectually rigorous, I mean that it, as I said, reflects an enduring issue or concern in social studies. There are a lot of them, of course. Compelling questions speak to the big ideas in history and the social sciences, both in concept and in the particular. Revolution is a particularly important and useful concept, but students need to understand that the American, French, Russian revolutions, while they share some traits, differ radically in terms of their context. Students understand some things by knowing the concept of revolution, but their understandings grow or develop exponentially when they can see how the particulars of different kinds of revolutions have played out over time. Second, compelling questions demand the use of multiple disciplinary lenses and perspectives. No social problem is by itself either economic or political or historical or geographic alone. The challenges that we face in society are multifaceted, so they demand that we use the power of history and the social science disciplines, both individually and in combination, to address them. And so if the study of social issues benefits from a multidisciplinary approach, so too does it benefit from an examination from multiple perspectives. Again, there's no social problem or social issue on which there's universal agreement. So it only makes sense to examine those issues that teachers put in front of kids from differing vantage points. Compelling questions need to be worth investigating from an academic angle, but they also need to be worth exploring from a student angle. Recall Bruner's claim, any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest fashion to any child at any stage of development. If we're really going to take this point seriously, it does not mean that we have to dumb down the curriculum. In fact, I'd argue it means just the opposite. Teachers should teach intellectually ambitious material. The key, however, is to see within those ideas to be taught the elements that teachers know that students care about. It is not the case that students are uninterested in natural resources or supply and demand or the New Deal per se. It is the case that teachers need to pull from those ideas. They need to pull from those ideas the relevant connections to students' lives. So let's take a minute and think about what kids do care about. Teachers tend to have less trouble identifying the intellectually rigorous ideas than they do identifying those elements of ideas that speak to kids' knowledge and experience. It's not that we can't think about what gets under kids' skin. It's just that we already know which ideas are important, and we take for granted that students will too. Surefire way to get under kids' skin is to make it clear that adults in the past, or perhaps even in the present, have done something that if a kid did it would elicit a scolding or something else, some other kind of reprimand. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, there are lots of examples where adults have done pretty dumb things. And while you can't tie every inquiry or every unit to that, although I suppose in some ways you could, it's a pretty surefire way of helping kids get an interest or develop an interest in what sorts of things adults might be doing or things that might help them see a way into the inquiry. Anybody have any other thoughts? Let me go through a few that have come out in some of the sessions that we've done. One of the things that kids seem to care inordinately a high amount about is the whole idea of justice, fairness, equality, however you want to frame it. Kids of all ages, preschool kids through 12th graders, have a very finely honed sense of what is fair and what is not fair. They may not always be able to apply that to other people as fairly as they do to themselves. But in fact, the idea that if we can connect the units that we're teaching with kids' understandings about whether the participants were acting or receiving fair treatment seems to be a pretty good way to bring an inquiry to life in the classroom. Other things that kids care about a lot, relationships. Even the youngest child knows about friendship and the different manifestations of what friendship can mean. And so trying to find ways to bring the complex and complicated ideas about relationships, friendships, that sort of thing, into the inquiries that you're developing is a pretty good way of making a connection that's relevant to kids' lives. So those are just a few of the ways that we can think about creating our compelling questions that really serve both sets of ideas. They need to be intellectually rigorous, for sure, but they also need to be things that we know that the students sitting in front of us really care about. And I see that Donna has picked up on the idea. She writes, "My students are writing about Native Americans and early European explorers right now, and they're very invested in the sense of fair play." Absolutely. And Kenneth is writing about money. Interesting that kids might be interested in money. They have some pretty, as you know, they have some pretty odd ideas about money sometimes, but they're quite interested in it, and they're quite willing to engage with ideas about it if we can bring them into the kinds of conversations that make sense to them. Well, let's now see if we can't apply these two ideas of intellectually rigorous and student relevant to a set of compelling questions that I've drafted. But here are some examples, and your task at this point is to decide whether one or more of these are compelling or not compelling. So the question, where are we? Compelling or maybe not so compelling? What were the causes of the Industrial Revolution? Why is Albany the capital of New York? Can Canada and the US be friends forever? Who won the Cold War? Who are community helpers? And what's the deal with hair? So nominate one of those as compelling or not so compelling, but then the key thing is to make sure you explain briefly why you think it's both relevant or not, and relevant both intellectually and to kids. Let's see what you come up with. So Gloria nominates, can Canada and the US be friends forever, as a compelling question, weighing of perspectives in problem solving. It's one of my favorites too, to be honest, because of this notion of friendship and how both simple it seems on the surface and yet complex below the surface. And the idea that countries might, in some ways, act as friends or not so friendly, I think is a nice way of bringing kids into a conversation. Let's see, who else has nominated one? Mary Ellen nominates the who won the Cold War question, depending on the way that one defines winning. Isn't that interesting? Because we usually think that winning is a clear-cut decision. And yet, the notion of winning in the context of the Cold War, where I suppose some people would argue that we're still fighting the Cold War, might in fact be a way of both bringing kids into an intellectual conversation, but also one that they're going to have some perspectives on. Kenneth suggests Albany, the capital of New York, could be compelling. Why not the biggest city? New York is the financial capital of the world. How do we decide where a capital should be? Yeah, it turns out that Albany is the capital for lots of reasons, but not because it's the most attractive city in New York. I can make that claim. and certainly it's not the financial center. So how does one place get designated as the capital of a state? Seems to be interesting. Lori nominates Where Are We? Because it tackles an important geographic issue. It's relevant to kids and also invites multiple perspectives. It's also one of those questions that if you were to walk into your second or third grade class and say to the kids, I have been up all night long thinking about this question. I simply can't get it out of my head. I need your help. Where are we? Your students are likely to think that you have lost your mind and you have gotten under their skin. So A for effort on making something relevant to kids. And as Laura points out, there are huge ways that we can use that question to teach about geography, because where we are situated turns out to be much more complex than just the physical manifestation of where we are. So we've got a couple more. I'm looking down through to see if anyone is pointing out that one question might be not so compelling. Several of you are quite tickled, however, with the question of what's the deal with hair. It's interesting, you know, and in some ways, I wonder if we couldn't teach the entire global or world history course just focusing on how hairstyles change over time. Any nominations for questions that aren't so compelling? We'll take another minute or two. People are still hung up on the hair question. Very interesting. So Mary Ellen nominates Causes of the Industrial Revolution, not so compelling to me or my students. Pretty concrete answers. I would guess that might not rate high on the compelling question scale either. But I want to make a point here, and that is I want to make 2 points. Compelling questions are not compelling because they're cute or clever. Kids will see through that pretty quickly. So there has to be something meaningful behind the questions. But at the same time, a compelling question is not a way to avoid talking about the real stuff of social studies, the real facts, concepts, generalizations, all of that. Those things matter. The causes of the Industrial Revolution matter. But do we have to start with that question? I don't think so. I don't think so, particularly if we know that it's not going to cause our students to raise their hands and raise their eyes and start thinking with us. So I think that the thing that is tricky about compelling questions in some ways is, again, we want to articulate the intellectual benefit that kids will be involved with. But I think it's really key for us to sort of think our way into what third graders care about, what seventh graders care about, what 12th graders care about. And while there are some similarities, there are differences. It's also really important to think about your particular third graders or seventh graders or 12th graders, because anybody who's taught secondary school knows that the students that you have in period 1 class may respond entirely different to the things that you're working on than the kids who come in 45 minutes later in period 2. So knowing your particular students is so key to this idea of crafting compelling questions that really are going to move us along the way. I just want to make one more point in the comments. I see that Mary Ellen has written, I think the Industrial Revolution causes acts better as a supporting question. Nice point, Mary Ellen. I think we'll come back to that in a minute. So let's push on. So if you were all here with me, we would do this task where I would put you in groups and ask some folks from early elementary to work on on the topic of rules and try to create a compelling question around it. For our middle school folks, I'd ask you to create a compelling question around the Civil War. And if you're in 10th grade or anywhere in the high school, the topic of globalization probably is going to be relevant. So we won't take the time now to do that. But if you're working with your colleagues in schools and across your districts, this might be a way to get them involved by starting to think about how would you craft questions around these three topics that would get under kids' skin. There are also, in the investigation itself, a set of 3 or 4 questions that I've posed that should help you and your colleagues think about how to get to compelling question land, perhaps a little faster than you might normally. So let's now turn to supporting questions. Supporting questions have 4 functions. They have to support and extend the compelling question. They provide a kind of scaffolding for the compelling question. They have to represent the disciplinary knowledge that you want kids to wrestle with. They have to reflect the sources, the information, the content that you put in front of kids, or that you have them go out and find. And then finally, they have to inspire formative performance tasks. In other words, we don't want to start teaching on day 1 and then end teaching on day 5 or 10, and then just have one assessment along the way. We kind of want to know whether the kids are with us. And so one of the things that I'm a big advocate of is creating tasks along the way that go along with the supporting questions. So on the pedagogical side, supporting questions really offer a set of guideposts or scaffolds around which teachers can build instructional activities based on the knowledge and ability of their kids. So let's look at an example now. So here's a question. Did Reconstruction really free African Americans? Again, if we were in the same room, I'd ask us to spend a little time thinking about whether that question really is compelling or not. I'm going to argue that it is, and in part because of the question or the word really. So much of what kids are going to need to wrestle with in these units has to do with value judgments and judgments across time. And so the notion of whether Reconstruction truly freed African Americans, given that at the time, certain things certainly did not change, and perhaps did not change for many, many years afterwards, I think gives it some relevance to kids and is certainly an intellectually important kind of topic. So then the 3 supporting questions are a way to get at that compelling question. So question 1, how did Frederick Douglass define freedom before and during the Civil War? Supporting question 2, how effective were Reconstruction policies in establishing freedom? And supporting question 3, how did developments in the South impact the freedom of African Americans? So these 3 questions, we think, put kids in a place where they really are able to address this big question of whether Reconstruction really freed African Americans or not. Obviously, there are 100 different manifestations of supporting questions that could take kids in tangents around that compelling question. But we thought that these 3 questions, by focusing in on this notion of freedom, really give kids an opportunity to return to the compelling question when it comes time to do the summative task, which is making an evidence-based argument. Now, just a couple of points more about these supporting questions. We've developed these questions, my colleagues and I, and vetted them with a number of teachers, but that has no bearing on whether you, as individuals or in a collective, think that these questions work or not. Supporting questions are identified as a way to help bring together the scaffolding for a compelling question and for an inquiry. But whether you use these questions or whether you use them in this order or a different order, whether you substitute a new question for supporting question 3 or throw out the whole bunch and create a whole new series, the idea is that supporting questions need to reflect the way that you want to proceed through an inquiry and build those ideas in ways that you think that your particular students are going to be able to best fill the bill. So again, here would be another audience participation opportunity if we were working on this webinar in person. So as you're working with your colleagues, if you've developed some compelling questions along the way, it might be now a nice time to try your hand at creating a sequence of supporting questions. And again, the idea is that you need to sort of scaffold the ideas and the sources and things that you're going to have kids working with. All right. So if we were in an active session, I would ask you to share some of those examples of supporting questions. It looks like some of you are starting to play around with additional compelling questions around the topic of Reconstruction. I see some pretty cool ideas starting to emerge there. One of the tricks that we've been finding, though, is that sometimes you can have a really great, compelling question, but you can't really come up with more. It's so compelling that you can't really come up with any particulars in terms of supporting questions. Or what usually happens more often is that you get a decent, compelling question in mind, but as you work through the supporting questions, you realize that you have to go back and tweak that compelling question because it's really not, it's kind of taking kids in a different direction than what you had actually intended them to do. So this is why I had the video clip early on, because this notion of putting all of the balls of the inquiry arc in the air at the same time, while it might seem intimidating, really is an important instructional and pedagogical thing to do, because we kind of have to weigh the relevance of our compelling question against the other points or the other parts of the inquiries that we're developing. So let me give you a quick example. Someone in one of the workshops I was doing came up with the compelling question for our unit on global trade of, where did you get that t-shirt? Well, everybody in the room started buzzing about that question. That seemed like it was appropriate to the content. It also seemed like something that kids might pick up their ears and start listening to. But then when we started thinking about, well, if kids were going to make an argument related to that topic, do you really want them to spend time making an argument about where they got their t-shirt? Or is there some other way of expressing a compelling question on that topic that actually seems a little bit more useful? So these ideas about compelling questions being supported by a series of scaffolded questions or supporting questions, and then thinking about all of it in light of the assessments and the sources, really is a key sort of thing. So I'm looking at some of the chat comments that are coming through, and there's a question that comes through that I'm interested in taking a look at. Tracy writes, when it comes to supporting questions, couldn't you ask students what they need to know in order to answer the compelling question? Absolutely, absolutely. One of the problems with trying to write curriculum is that you can't say in a curriculum document, now turn to the kids and ask them what questions they think are important. That would be a very easy way to write curriculum, but it's not a particularly helpful way always to when you're writing text for your colleagues. But Tracy's point is exactly to the point, and it's a huge idea that comes through in the C3 framework, and in that the idea that we're wanting to invite other kids, invite our students into the construction of the questions that they are using to frame their inquiries. That can be tricky because, as many of you know, sometimes kids do not have a whole lot of experience writing questions or thinking about questions beyond the immediate. And learning how to honor what kids know and can do in terms of their questions is a real skill. Mary Ellen has anticipated my next point, which is to say she's had success with the question formulation technique, and I would highly recommend that as something for you to all take a look at. QFT, or question formulation technique, is a product of the Right Question Institute. I think I have that right. They're a group out of Boston that's doing some incredible work with helping kids and teachers bring their ideas together in ways that really help and frame inquiries. So this notion of not only should the compelling questions come from teachers and supporting questions come from teachers, but that they might come from students as well is really, really important. All right, so what I'd like to do now is just take you through the last couple of slides that I have, which kind of set up the investigation that you may lead as you're working with your colleagues. So if you have seen the lesson plan template, and I see that Anna has brought up one section of it, you'll notice that there's a place for application and there's a place for connections to the Common Core state standards. Here's an opportunity for you and your colleagues to start thinking about what kinds of questions that you're starting to come up with. So, for example, it might be a nice thing to, in the application section, to just jot down a compelling question or two that you have, and maybe some notes about supporting questions that you might use to scaffold that compelling question. The connections to the Common Core should be very obvious. One of the Common Core in some ways kind of put a stamp on social studies by reducing us to just a couple of pages. But in lots and lots of ways, the Common Core did us two big favors. One, it really encouraged the idea that kids need to read much better, thicker, richer kinds of texts than they have been reading in social studies classes. And then the second thing that the Common Core encourages, which is helpful to us, is this idea of writing more ambitiously. Multiple choice questions absolutely have a role, they have a place in classrooms and in state assessments and that sort of thing. Multiple choice questions get at some important kinds of knowledge, but they ought not to be the only way that we assess kids. And so having kids write evidence-based arguments is huge, a huge boon to where we think that social studies, ambitious social studies instruction really ought to go. So if you now turn to page 12, and I think Anna's going to put that slide up as well, this is where you can start to see how you can start crafting the components of an inquiry. So here in Dimension 1, first box, questions about how things work, interpretations and applications of concepts, all of those sorts of things that underlie a compelling question. So if you and your colleagues were to start putting ideas in about the language for your compelling questions, you have a box for supporting questions, and then there's a really helpful box underneath that, the one that is entitled Determining Helpful Sources. Because one of the things that we found in the New York project that is the biggest problem is being able to find good differentiated sources in order to put in kids' hands. We obviously want to put primary source documents in front of children, but as you all know, just because a document was written in 1776 does not mean that it's automatically going to translate into understanding for kids in 2015. Same thing with secondary sources. There are excellent secondary sources out there, but they may or may not be written at a level and at a point where your particular students are going to be able to engage with them seriously. So one of the things that you're going to always want to think about when you're developing compelling and supporting questions is, can I find the sources that are going to be able to help me bring kids strongly and in an engaging fashion into the inquiries? All right, Anna, let's push on to the next one. All right, so our time is starting to wind down now. I wanted to offer a couple of things for you to think about, again, both tonight and as you start to think about doing your own work with the C3 framework and working with others. First of all, what are the goals or intentions that you have for utilizing questions as you plan your curriculum inquiries? How are your colleagues going to respond to that kind of idea? Are they going to embrace it, or are they just going to find it, as some may say, the sort of next new thing? What we find in the dozens and dozens of workshops and professional development sessions that we do across the state of New York with the Toolkit Project is we find teachers immediately nodding their heads and gravitating to the idea, making notes to themselves about how they can frame a particular inquiry that they've been thinking about. And I'll be very honest, one of the ways that I think is the best thing to do when you're broaching this kind of topic is to ask people to think about the 1 or 2 units that they always dread teaching because they just can't figure out a way to bring it to light for kids, and see if they can't write a compelling question for it or not. You know, the Industrial Revolution is my big bugaboo. I'm sure it's important on many, many levels, but I have yet to come up with a compelling question that really drives me to think that I'd want to rush into the class the next morning and put it forward. So as you're thinking about working with your colleagues, think about ways that you can bring them into this process of imagining questions as the starting point for their units or for their inquiries. The second thing is to start thinking about what implications there might be for teachers' instruction if they start planning curriculum in these kinds of ways. One of the things that I think is useful to understand about the inquiry arc approach to social studies teaching is that it really gives teachers free rein to use any and every instructional strategy that they have in their arsenal. Obviously, lecturing every day, all day for 180 days is one way of doing it. But we have so many other ways that we can use our instructional practices to bring students into the work that we think is so important and engage them. And so we ought not to be limited by 1 or 2 instructional strategies. If you really think about the inquiry arc, there's no prescription there for the kind of instruction that teachers do. Teachers who are more comfortable in a teacher-centered classroom can certainly move forward with an inquiry-based set of units. What they will need to do, however, is give kids some opportunities to respond to their teacher-centered practices. So that notion of creating formative performance tasks is really, really important. Giving kids opportunities to tell us what they're understanding, what sense they're making of the ideas that we have is just really, really important. And then the third question that I would encourage you all to think about is, what do you need if you want to move forward in this direction and start doing the work yourself and with your colleagues? What sorts of supports do you need? What kinds of resources might be important as you move forward? And as you think about all of this, I hope that you will consider participating in the whole range of professional development investigations in this seminar or in this webinar series. As I understand it, you can find them at socialstudies.org/C3. That is socialstudies.org/C3. C3. And so at this point, I guess we have a couple of minutes left. If people have questions, why don't you go ahead and put them into the chat. I'll read them aloud, and we'll see what kind of trouble we can get into on this medium of webinars. So it looks like a couple of people have posted some information about the Right Question Institute. There's a TED Talk that Mary Ellen has sent a link forward.
Yep.
So Kenneth asked, the big fear that I experience when talking about inquiry is that they worry about the depth required when inquiry learning versus the breadth of the curriculum they feel they must cover. It's an absolutely key point. And if you try to brush it over, your colleagues are going to turn you off immediately. The problem with the premise of the question is that we can't possibly cover the entire social studies curriculum. The former New York State 11th grade curriculum for 11th grade was 33 single-spaced pages. That's a lot of stuff to cover. In fact, I'm not even sure if you read those 33 single-spaced pages at a modest rate that you'd finish that in 180 days. So the fact of the matter is we always have to choose. We have to make very hard choices about the content that we're going to cover, that we're going to put into the units that we teach. And so I think the best response to the notion of coverage versus depth is the idea that you pick your spots. You perhaps don't do an inquiry-based unit for every topic that you have in your curriculum, but you work your way into it, and maybe you do 2 inquiry-based units for the first year that you try them out. And again, I would argue that you should try one of the ones that you're having some problem thinking about ways to get into it. I see Michelle is trying to give me a hand with my Industrial Revolution complex. She asked, was the Industrial Revolution a blessing or a curse? I think kids might respond to that. Thanks, Michelle. Let's see what else we've got. Mary Ellen has got an idea down here a little bit further that says, here's a link to Spencer Kagan's Q matrix. I don't know that, but she makes the point that she finds it works well with ELL learners to help them formulate questions. And again, she's given us a website to go to take a look at that. I'm really encouraged by the examples of compelling questions that I'm seeing you posting here. Obviously, I have taught this lesson quite well because you've all started to master the idea. The trick, as I said before, however, is can you translate that compelling question into viable supporting questions? And then, as I said, from the New York project, we're finding one of the biggest challenges is our compelling question works, our supporting question works, we've got some great formative tasks, and then we have trouble finding sources that really support all of that effort. So again, one of the things you'll want to keep in mind as you're thinking about different approaches to developing inquiries is, can I find the sources that are going to be accessible to my students? And if they're not accessible, can I modify them in ways that really will bring them into the experience of my particular students? It looks like you're all starting now to talk with one another, which is really terrific, about ways that you can reconstruct these sorts of questions. I see Michelle is asking the question, can you help me address the issue of proposing compelling questions that are biased or leading? Great question. And I think everything's fair game when it comes to compelling question land. Sometimes, I wouldn't do this maybe for the first inquiry that I do, where I ask a leading kind of question, but kids are going to know after a while, particularly if you talk with them about the idea or the concept of leading questions. Sometimes really what you want them to do is just take a stand and then find the evidence to support that stand. And if you need to use a leading question as a way to sort of get into that kind of territory, I say all is fair. Same thing with yes/no questions. A lot of people would argue that a yes/no question can't be compelling because it has to have a yes or a no answer. But I think as soon as you think about that seeming dilemma, it falls apart because, in fact, very few questions are you going to answer completely yes or completely no. And it always, answering the question yes or no is only the first stage. Then you have to supply the evidence that supports your answer. More importantly, however, I know very few yes or no questions that actually end up being only yes or no. Most of them seem to be a yes but, a no but. Mostly it's a yes, but sometimes it's a no. And those are all, that gray area between yes and no is all prime territory for kids to make and support arguments. So again, my point to Michelle's question is that I don't think there's really a bad way of creating a compelling question as long as there's some intellectual heft to it and it's a way to get under kids' skin. The trick, however, is not to try to just be cute or clever because that won't last very long. Kids will be on to you very soon after that. Looks like there's some other folks who are starting to think about photographs and images and all of that sort of thing. Tina asks, in your New York project, can you speak to specific challenges beyond questioning with C3 implementation? Yeah, Tina, I think the biggest one that we have found is, as I said just a minute ago, this idea of finding good sources that we can put in front of kids. We have a special challenge with the New York project because the units, the inquiries that we're developing are all going to be open sourced. When this project wraps up this summer, everybody in the United States, everybody in the world will have access to these inquiries that we've developed. That means, however, that we've had to put the actual sources, the actual text, the actual pictures, the actual images, that sort of thing, into these online inquiries. And as a result, that has presented a number of challenges because some folks, notably trade book companies, don't want us to put their entire trade book on rules, for example, online because their authors will lose royalties that way. We have a budget for buying permission for these sources that we're putting on, but it's not an infinite budget. And so in some cases, we're having to make compromises in terms of the sources that we're able to put on these inquiries in the New York project that you folks, if you do these for your own classroom, will not face. So it's a particular challenge of this big project that in some ways the sources issue is problematic. But in many ways you'll encounter the same sorts of things. Chiefly the idea that you've got a great source, but it's way beyond the reading ability of the kids that you have in front of you. So it looks like we have run out of time. Is that right, Anna? We're at the 7, according to my clock, we're at the 7:31.
That is correct. I see that, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I don't know if you want to take one last question or if you want to just, we can have people email you if there's a compelling question that they must ask of you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
is my email address was listed earlier, right, Anna?
that's correct, yes. At the beginning.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to emails. This project is consuming big chunks of my life, so I may not be able to get back to you in a day or so. But hang tight. I find this work is just incredibly compelling to me. And so I love talking about the ways that teachers come to understand these things. So thank you.
Yes, so it's just thank you for participating in this webinar, everyone. And if you could click on the brief evaluation hyperlink here that's highlighted, that will take you to just a brief survey to tell us how we're doing. And if you are interested in attending and participating in our next webinar that will take place on April 29th, it will be Scott Waring, and he will be doing the topic Dimension 3, evaluating sources and using evidence-led evidence. The link once more, so you can also, to register, click on this hyperlink on the highlighted letters, and that should take you to that registration form. This is again the other web link to the Literacy Learning Exchange so that you can go directly to that investigation piece that belongs to this webinar. It's the companion piece of this webinar. And you can click on the link, or you can click on Browse To, and that will take you directly to that web page. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me or email SG, understanding that SG may not be able to get back to you immediately, but will do his best to respond. All right. Well, thank you so much, SG. It's been a pleasure to have you on this webinar and doing, presenting on this topic. And thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Anna.
All right. Have a good night. Bye-bye.